how do you know where to start when it comes to ink? Each line is permanent. The medium can be fairly demanding, and it can be intimidating to know where to start when it comes to working with ink. These are common concerns, and so if they plague you, fret not. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the basic steps of sketching out a piece and then beginning to ink it, hopefully to close the gap a little bit and make it seem a little bit less intimidating. Ink is a wonderful medium to work with. There is something so tantalizing about the permanency of each mark that you put down, but also about the fact that it's such a stark contrast. When you work with a pencil or a ballpoint pen, things are so tremendously different from the final result. The piece that I'm working on sketching today is one of the prompts from Inktober this year, but it's kind of irrelevant. In fact, I went quite a different direction with the prompt, which was binoculars, and I ended up making it into a telescope. I used the same character that I've been playing with in a lot of these drawings, and she's simply looking through the telescope. However, on this drawing, a few into the prompts of Inktober, I decided to just have fun and do some really goofy things. I think this is a key aspect when you're starting on ink. If you are trying to make crazy precision-oriented drawings right away, it can be rather intimidating and quite difficult. And it's hard to allow yourself enough grace to continue moving forward. So if you do some goofy things, if you incorporate elements that are just there for fun and for laughs, it will sometimes help you move through those interim stages. I'm going to go ahead and jump to right when I start working with ink. I don't want to speed this video up very much, so I want you to be able to see how quickly, or actually how slowly, I actually draw. So here we are. I've finished just enough of the sketch to start working on the actual piece. I should probably go and finish the whole sketch, but I didn't want to. I was excited to get into the piece and start drawing on things. And there is an element of working over your sketch that is innately stressful, and that's why we're here. When you're taking a sketch to an inked piece, there are certain things to be aware of. One is you can sketch really, really loosely and lightly, but when you go to ink those, it can sometimes be quite difficult to know which line to go over. So if you are sketching pretty lazily or just, pretty loosely, it can be beneficial to go in and refine one of those lines, just to make it really clear to yourself when you start inking which line you actually want to ink. I also find for me that it's best to start off with a very, very thin pen. This is probably the thinnest that I own, and I generally do that because I'm focusing on really integral and really important components at the beginning. You'll notice, too, that I started off with the character's face. This is the part that if I mess up, the whole piece will be shot. And so I'd rather know that I'm messing something up right away than find out an hour, 2 hours in that the piece is not going to work out the way that I wanted to because I made some mistakes on very integral and very important components. So I often start with the most important thing. And this brings me to another point too, is if I make a mistake here, there are ways to fix it. Sometimes a stray mark that you make with pen can be turned into something else, and I do that quite frequently, especially if I overshoot when I'm trying to combine two lines to close a shape. I will often turn that into some texture that I use later on. But there's also things like acrylic pens. I use a white acrylic pen, I use a Posca, and I also have some white gel pens that I keep handy. In fact, if you just had some extra white gouache or white watercolor or white acrylic paint sitting around, you could potentially use those as well. They're going to be a little bit harder on the paper, depending on the thickness of the paper, but there is no shame in having to cover up a misstep, especially if there are other parts in that piece that are really lovely and you want to get back into. So I just want to throw that out there. As I continue to go on this sketch, I'm just trying to refine the shapes that I'm working on. And I'm working slowly because I'm not assuming that everything that I did in my sketch stage was correct. And this is a really fundamental thing. One of the problems I ran into, and I ran into with my students over the years, is when they started to ink a sketch and they just assumed that every single mark was correct. I've definitely made this mistake before, where one of those marks was maybe just a horizon line or a vanishing line, something that was giving me perspective, and then I inked it, and now I have this awkward, perfectly straight line in a very curvilinear drawing. So as you're inking, go slowly, especially on these first layers. The stuff that comes later when you're adding in the texture, when you're working on surface detail, is going to be far more entertaining and fun, but these stages you need to kind of go a little bit slowly, and that's fine. I often work with a brush pen in these stages too, and that is for two reasons. One, it allows a variance in line width, so I can sometimes get some really thin lines, and sometimes they're thicker. And piggybacking on that, the variance in line width actually adds a life and a character to the drawings that I really enjoy. When I've done drawings with a single pen where everything is 100% consistent on the line thickness, it looks a little bit more boring to me. It looks almost like something that I did an amateur job of inking on the computer on a program like Photoshop. So I have found that in my drawings, at least, I very much enjoy some line variance. So I've started using a whole handful of pens. Though for a long time when it came to ink, I just drew with one or two different varieties of micron, and that served me very well. Let's jump ahead again, just so we can get some more of this drawing. I've finished the character. I'm reasonably satisfied with the way that she came out. There are some pieces to her face and the expression that I'm not super stoked about, but I know that I'll be able to fix those later if I come back to them. So I'm going to continue now and start working on some of the shapes that are a lot more perspective oriented. So my pace will have slowed down a little bit. I'm trying to make sure that these lines are as accurate as I can make them, especially considering I'm using one of my brush pens. This is something for a stage like this where you could use a ruler if you want to. I don't much, and especially on this particular drawing, I want the shapes to kind of be awkward and feel like they're banged up and they're old. And so using a ruler would actually add some artificiality to that, and so I'm staying away from it. But if you want perfect lines, there is no problem using a ruler. In fact, there is no problem changing the direction of the drawing too, and I run into this problem frequently for videos. And if you watch a lot of videos, you might be absorbing this detail without even knowing it. So I want to take just a moment and talk about that. When I am drawing normally, freehand, or I'm not recording things, I will shift the direction of my drawing, or I will get up and move to a different portion of the drawing so that I can make sure my lines are as accurate as possible. I struggle to draw horizontal lines that are long and straight. I'm much better about drawing vertical lines, lines that are coming toward me. The biggest reason for this is that's actually how the angle on the wrist and the elbow work. It's much easier for humans to draw lines that are coming toward them than it is to draw lines that are going side to side. And that's because if you just hold out your arm and you move it in that arc, your arm is moving on a curved arc because you have a pivot point in your elbow or your shoulder or your wrist. You can minimize this, of course, by drawing from your shoulder more than drawing from your elbow or wrist, and I would highly recommend that you practice that. But that is a long-term strategy that takes a bit of time to really make not feel awkward and not make your arms sore. But if you are finding that you're trying to trace these lines onto your finished piece, I would highly recommend that you just shift your sketchbook or your piece of paper to an angle that works better for you, especially in this stage where you're just trying to get your lines traced into your final ink piece. And now I've mentioned tracing twice, so I want to take a moment and think about that, because there is a stigma that comes with tracing. I'm not 100% sure where it comes from, but if I had to guess, it's the fact that tracing, at least here in the United States, is often done most by kids who are just trying to get an image from one place onto another piece of paper. And so it tends to be something that is associated with being an amateur artist or an unprofessional artist. And I just want to dispel that. Especially in a case like this, if you are sketching out your own thing and then tracing it onto another form, there is no problem with that. What I'm doing right now is I'm using an undersketch and then I'm going to ink over the top. That's what you're watching happen. This is kind of a cool part. I like this with all of the, I did candles on top. Originally my plan, I was going to use a lot of candles throughout the whole piece to kind of light it because it's in this underground cavern. I kind of lost the plot halfway through, but you know, when I get to the chickens and the fishbowl, I feel like it really comes back. This is, again, just a goofy thing that I'm trying to have fun with. And it was fun. It was a very fun drawing to work on. But getting back to the tracing, right now what I'm doing is I'm working on an under sketch. And as I ink this, I'm going to go back and I'm going to erase all those pencil lines. It might at the end give the illusion that I did all of this totally freehand, and I'm not trying to pull the wool over on anyone's eyes. It just looks better when you get to that point. You know, I suppose if you're doing that and you're not telling anyone when they ask or you're lying about it, that's not great. But another way to do this that's really common is to use light from behind your piece to actually just take your sketch from one sheet of paper and move it on to another. Back in the day, we did this with windows. We would tape our piece of paper to a window. They eventually came out with light tables and light trays where it's just a device that shines a light underneath and you can put one paper on top of another and trace it. If this is a strategy that you have available to you, it works wonders. And again, there's a little bit of a stigma with it because it is tracing, but in any case where you're tracing your own piece, this is a 100% moot point. And I would argue that it is most of the time, unless you're plagiarizing. But I would encourage you to get your sketch the way you like it and then find your appropriate way to trace that so you can keep the life that comes with a sketch and pull it into your inking piece. And that's another thing that I kind of want to focus on with this, is the fact that I do think it is beneficial to sketch first and then ink it. I think that having the stage where you're going over top of your own drawing is actually beneficial. It is actually better than if you were to just do all of this freehand. This comes from the fact that you can sometimes be stiff when you're working with a permanent medium such as ink. And so if you are working over top of a sketch, something that was much more loose, you didn't really have a care in the world and you were just throwing things down, it can sometimes make your final drawing still preserve some of that liveliness that came from the sketching phase. And so I would encourage you to sketch first before you ink things. To that end, I would recommend that you work with a pretty fine pencil. I use the Prisma Colorase Red here, which is a fancy pencil, not very expensive, but fancy nonetheless to an old man like me. And it's just fun. I like using the red because it feels kind of dynamic and interesting, and it's different from the blacks that I'm working with. But I've certainly just used regular mechanical pencils over the years. I do think mechanical pencils are better for this manner of sketching because the lines are finer and it's going to be a little bit harder to blur them and to smudge things. I actually haven't smudged this Colorase pencil at all at any point in time, which is lovely. But if you are working with a just regular pencil, just be careful that you don't smudge too much. The nice part is, though, that once the ink is totally dry, you can go back over and you can erase those smudges even if they occur. So coming back to taking a sketch to an inked piece, you can see this is a slow process. I've already skipped twice, and we are 13 minutes into this video, if my time matches yours. It is a slow process, and I would encourage you to just embrace that monotony. I find this stage of the drawing fun. Not quite as fun as the texturing stage, because once all of the big decisions are done, then it's like, oh, cool, now I can just go in and make things look interesting. But this stage is incredibly important, and you have to move slowly. I would encourage you to put on a show that you've watched 100 times. For me, that'd be putting on Lord of the Rings in the background. I can literally watch it in my mind because I've seen it so many times. But if you have a TV show like that, or you have a podcast you like, or if you want to just throw on some lore video, I will often watch videos by Smotown. He does stuff on Bloodborne, the Dark Souls series, Elden Ring, lots of just wonderful, beautifully accented lore to listen to. So if you have something like that that is enjoyable, I would recommend just putting that on and just enjoying the monotony as you work on things. And maybe go check Smotown out too, because, you know, if you play Elden Ring and video games like that, it's just a blast to listen to. I'm going to skip ahead one final time. You can see now we're in the later stages of this drawing. I'm actually going to spend several more hours after this developing and texturing things, but most of the base of this drawing is actually complete now. Like I mentioned, you are going to need some patience to get through these stages, but it's important that you do so. You are setting yourself up well for later, and that's so much of what drawing is in the first place. I think some people shy away from working with ink, particularly because it requires this patience, particularly because it's a little bit intimidating, and sometimes there's a couple stages to working on things. It's a little bit like a hybrid between traditional drawing and painting. If for no other reason, just the fact that the ink takes a little bit of time to dry, you have to think about how it moves and how it functions. In general, though, ink is an incredibly rewarding medium to work with. I certainly enjoy it, and I enjoy it for so many of the reasons that I've mentioned here. So I would encourage you, when you are working on large or even small ink pieces, don't shy away from sketching things out first, and then inking right over top. If you are patient enough to let your ink dry entirely, assuming you're using waterproof ink, you can go back through and just erase everything out afterwards. And then you have this nice, pristine drawing that you can just leave as is, or you can continue to modify and add texture to. Well, as always, thanks for watching. I hope that this was beneficial to you. I know this was a little bit different than some of the direct instruction videos I've done on ink recently, but I think both sides of this are important. If there's anything additionally that you have questions about concerning what I talked about today, please let me know in the comments below. And you can feel free in the same location to share if there's anything specific you'd like to hear about when it comes to ink. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.